some of the chaos surrounding the president and these investigation into not just the president. That was the focus, of course, because of Rudy Giuliani's interview on Hannity last night, but also the continuing look at Trump associates. Michael Caputo, former Trump campaign aide, you've probably seen him on the news, cable news channels, right? He testified before the Senate Intelligence Committee yesterday. At the conclusion of his testimony, he had some pointed words. Your investigation and others into the allegations of Trump campaign collusion with Russia are costing my family a great deal of money, more than $125,000, making a visceral impact on my children. Now I must move back to Washington, New York, Miami, or elsewhere just so I can make enough money to pay off these legal bills. And I know I have you to thank for it. Here's how I know. How many of you know Daniel Jones, former Senate Intel staffer for Senator Difey? Great guy, right? Most of you work with him. One of you probably just talked to him this morning. Of course, very few of us in flyover country knew Daniel until recently. Now we know that he quit his job with the Senate committee not long ago to raise $50 million from 10 rich Democrats to finance more work on the Fusion GPS Russian dossier. The one thing the FBI used to get a FISA warrant and intimidate President Trump without anyone admitting that it was paid for by Clinton. In fact, good old Dan has been raising and spending millions to confirm the unconfirmable, and of course, to keep all his old intel colleagues up to speed on what Fusion GPS and British and Russian spies have found. Got to keep that Russia story in the news. He goes on to just detail what he knows to be true. That gives you a flavor of it. What America needs is an investigation of the investigators. I want to know who is paying for the spies' work in coordinating this attack on President Trump. I want to know who Dan Jones is talking to across the investigations, from the FBI to the Southern District of New York to the OSC to the Department of Justice to Congress. Forget about the death threats against my family. I want to know who cost us so much money, who crushed our kids, who forced us out of our home, all because you lost an election. I want to know because God damn you to hell. Getting intense, but when people's lives are being destroyed, you can understand a pointed response. That's Michael Caputo before the Senate Intel Committee yesterday. For more on this topic in a roundabout way, we're pleased to be joined by Paul Kengor, who's a professor of poli-sci at Grove City College. He's the author of the book Dupes, How America's Adversaries Have Manipulated Progressives for a Century. And I assume we're starting with the Bolshevik Revolution there. Professor Kengor, thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
Well, thanks, Dan and Amy. Good to be with you.
America's adversaries manipulating progressives. Are we talking about Soviet/Russian adversaries?
Oh, yes. And I mean, that indeed has truly been going on for a century. I mean, we just marked the 100th anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution last fall, 2017. And, you know, you mentioned, Dan, what's going on with Russia collusion, the 2016 election. And I mean, look, yeah, I agree that if there's anything smelly out there, they should look into it. And Vladimir Putin is an old KGB guy, and nothing the Russians ever do ever surprises me. It's one of the reasons why I'm a conservative, right? but it's interesting to see liberals finally care or give a whit or suddenly have their antenna up where they're suspicious about the Russians because, lo and behold, wow, they might have heard Hillary Clinton, right? It's not like the previous 100 years of Russian disinformation and misinformation and manipulation of liberals. That never seemed to bother them. But they've been at this craft for a long time. They're really good at it.
Well, do you think President Trump or the Department of Justice or anybody is stopping Russia from interfering in future elections, especially the upcoming midterms?
Yeah. Well, I don't know. I mean, and so I don't know if this is what Mueller is looking into or not. The example that I give in this book, Dupes, I mean, this is stunning. It was May 1983, and people listening to this, they're gonna find this hard to believe because the media has never followed it, never paid attention to it. And I actually first broke this in Dupes in 2010, so we're releasing it again now in 2018, an updated version. But we know this. This is a fact. This is indisputable. We have the documents. in May 1983, and this was the context of the coming 1984 presidential re-election campaign of Ronald Reagan, Senator Ted Kennedy, who was a sitting senator at that time, he confidentially reached out to the head of the KGB, Viktor Chebrikov, and the head of the USSR, Yuri Andropov, with an offer to work against Reagan. And the actual May 14, 1983 KGB memo, and this was declassified in 1992. All right, so this memo has been around for a while, and I reprinted the whole thing in Russian and also in English. But it says the goal here is to, quote, counter the militaristic policies of Reagan, quote unquote, to influence Americans, quote unquote, toward the Soviet position. The memo said Kennedy was greatly disturbed by Reagan, but very impressed with Yuri Andropov. And if that memo, you guys, if a memo like that existed today from 2016 with Donald Trump's name on it, the Democrats would be drawing up the impeachment papers right now, and there wouldn't be a Republican who could stop them. But this is the kind of thing that their guys have done on their side for literally decades. And as I said, I first reported this in 2010. I can tell you without exaggeration, I never got a single call from CNN, the Washington Post, the New York Times, nothing. And we're releasing it again this week in 2018. I guarantee you, I will not get a single call again from any of those sources. I promise you that. I'd bet $100,000 that they won't call me. It's just shows like yours and no others, and not anything in the liberal media that's going to give any attention to this. But with Trump, it's 24/7. It's all they care about.
It's really incredible. I didn't realize that. It's really incredible. Maybe with the updating of Ted Kennedy's legacy, thanks to the Chappaquiddick movie, maybe they could add this to the update.
Well, and I mean, really, and in all seriousness, that would be the perfect. I mean, right? We're both in the media. We know how this works. That'd be the perfect so-called hook, right? Mm-hmm. By the media to finally give us some attention. They always say, "Well, Kennedy's been dead for however many years. This is out of the news," right? So old news is never news if it affects Democrats or liberals, right? I mean, if Donald Trump was a liberal, they'd say, "Well, it happened back in 2016." That's old news, right? Yeah, it's not going on today. But yeah, with the Chappaquiddick thing, and I would add here, your lion of the Senate there, this great liberal hero, Ted Kennedy, is dead now. So why not go ahead and give it some attention now? It's not going to hurt him. But this is what they do. They protect their guys literally to the grave. They really do. Whereas if Ted Kennedy had an R next to his name instead of a D, I mean they'd be out digging up this. They'd be at the cemetery right now with cameras and microphones, trying to interview a corpse if they could.
That's incredible. Now I want to go back to Russia for a moment, because it seems like the progressives, the left, the cultural Marxists, and the more appropriate term perhaps. Their main problem with 21st century Russia is that it's not the 20th century Soviet Union. And I refer you to one of your colleagues in academia, Jason Barker, who is an associate professor of philosophy at a university in South Korea, who penned a piece on the occasion of the May Day Eve. Happy birthday, Karl Marx. You were right. It was sort of a remarkable recasting of the 20th century ongoing by some of your colleagues in higher ed.
Oh, it's absolutely right. And in fact, I'll give you a heads up on this. I have two pieces tomorrow. One in the Wall Street Journal that's on the 200th anniversary of Marx, and another in American Spectator tomorrow, which addresses classical Marxism versus cultural Marxism. And you're exactly right. In fact, the New York Times has been so egregious on this that all through 2017, they were running these centenary pieces on 100 years of communism, and they actually had pieces. One of them talked about how, I'm trying to give you the exact words, the exact language off the top of my head. Communism made women's lives better in China.
Oh, really?
which is just absurd. And the other one actually argued, people are going to think that I'm joking, but go ahead and look this up. It said that communism gave women better sex.
We talked about that on this show. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely true.
I mean, absolutely unbelievable. And I wrote about that at the time also for an American Spectator piece. And one of the readers in the reader comments said that he worked at Checkpoint Charlie, and he used to look over beyond the Berlin Wall into East Berlin. And he said, this is probably right, because come about 5 or 6 o'clock in the evening, all the electricity would go out, and there was really nothing else to do in the communist world but have sex. So maybe the Times is onto something there.
Well, how do these adversaries, particularly of the Russian variety, how do they continue to manipulate the left in our cultural and civic institutions today?
Well, they're really good at it, and I know there are probably people listening right now that are saying, "Well, why did you say that they do that to Republicans too?" Well, the main reason for this is that the communists on the far left of the ideological spectrum know that they're going to have more success with liberals and progressives who, if they're not pro-communist, at least share some sympathies with communists, right? The redistribution of wealth, taking money from the rich, giving it to the poor, collectivism. And you're going to have far more success duping and manipulating a Ted Kennedy or a Nancy Pelosi or a Barbara Boxer, a John Kerry in Vietnam, than you would a William F. Buckley Jr. or a Ronald Reagan or a Joe McCarthy. So they've always known where to go to get their suckers, to get their dupes. And the phrase that Vladimir Lenin used was useful idiot. Yeah. And he knew he wasn't going to get his useful idiots from right-wingers. The right-wingers were, obsessed. I'd call it a healthy obsession, obsessed with communism, anti-communism. You're going to find these people on the softer kind of secular, progressive, liberal left.
All of those details and more can be found in Paul Kengor's updated book, Dupes, How America's Adversaries Have Manipulated Progressives for a Century, professor of poli-sci at Grove City College. Paul Kengor, thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
Hey, anytime. Give me a call anytime.
Thank you.
Thanks. And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.